All right, let's get started here with our next speaker. You saw him yesterday. Class was in session with the amazing Dr. Simeon Hein. We're back in session. Summer recess is over. Come on back up. Dr. Simeon Hein, everybody.
Thanks very much, Toad. And thanks for being here again.
Need that fixed?
What do you think? Just trying to. Okay. Well, thanks for coming back. We're going to go on to extend what we were talking about last night with fractal geometry. And what I was attempting to convince you is that between matter and energy, there's this middle ground called fractal phantoms. This is what the scientists call it. And that the reality around us that looks so solid at a more microscopic scale is often made up of fractal, self-similar structures that keep fractalizing all the way down to the zero-point field, where we know quantum physicists have told us that there's huge amounts of energy. You know, you've often heard this phrase that a cubic centimeter of the quantum vacuum is equivalent to like 20,000 light years in all directions of solid objects, something like that. So this is why you can get huge amounts of energy concentrated into a small space, because this field of energy that we're a part of that generates matter has a huge potential energy. And so this is interesting, folks, because of the sun, they're all divided. I've actually never given, we got one brave soul in the middle. That was great listening to Ron Moorhead. When I first started studying this subject, and I'm a relative newcomer to the subject area, Ron Moorhead's book, Voices in the Wilderness, was one of the first books I read about the subject. Don Monroe was one of the first researchers I met over in Bailey, Colorado at one of the conferences held by the Sasquatch Outpost, along with Russian researcher Igor Portsev. And so reading Ron's book and listening to his experiences, it wasn't just about encountering these beings, these ancient humans, whoever they are, with their own language, which it's true, it's just a monumental discovery, especially the movie we saw, the preview last night, for the first recorded interactions, not interactions, but recorded interactions with modern technology of humans interacting with other types of humans or hybrids, whatever we find out they are. But if you read Ron's books, you'll see that there are also, he encountered interesting sounds, gong-like sounds above the hunting cabins that sounded like a tuning fork. There was that incident, you'll remember, where it sounded like the hunting camp was being taken apart and all the dishes and metal objects were clanging together, as Ron said, and he sounded like the whole thing was being discombobulated by angry Sasquatch. And then they would go out in the morning and nothing's been touched. How do you explain that one? Okay, and then there was the invisibility that Ron talked about. He often says, if you listen to his interviews or talk to him, that these Sasquatch should have cast shadows on the hunting cabin because they had the mics embedded right in the walls, right, of the hunting structure. And there were cracks between the boards. You saw pictures of it last night in the Voices in the Wilderness movie preview. But you couldn't see any Sasquatch. Ron said he once went out and looked to try to find them, and they're not there. He actually only had one sighting in all his 9 visits. According to my understanding, I saw one in a distance, and it was closer to the parking lot where he started off with the horses, right? So you've got invisibility, strange sounds, and then finally, we can't leave out the weird orbs and luminous objects, one of which looked like a Star Wars lightsaber moving its way through the forest, and all the other objects that he saw. Well, this is the thing. If you start looking into the literature of people's Bigfoot, Jibberoo, Sasquatch encounters, whatever we call them, you hear the same sort of thing over and over again. This interesting metallic sounds, their ability to mimic any sound they've ever heard. It was Tom Powell, I think he said this at the Kalispell conference last year, Dave Blighty's Kalispell conference, that he thinks they have like a hard drive embedded in their chest and they just record every sound they've ever heard and can replay it. It almost seems like that. And of course from Ron Moorhead, the vocalizations seem to suggest that they have two sets of vocal cords and they can speak on the inhale and the exhale. Anyway, this all raises a lot of questions for us, because if we want to get past this logjam where we've been at, where, you know, we have these encounters, very good, documented encounters from Ron with state-of-the-art recording equipment, at least in the 70s, right? They lugged up these heavy cassette recorders and recording equipment. How do we explain this type of experience? So I think I'm going to present part 2 right now, continuing from last night, of the very weird types of matter that seem similar to what Ron's talking about that we have from cold fusion, linear reactors. And it's built around fractal vortex structures. So you're all familiar with the vortex. You've seen water going down a drain. You've either seen a tornado or have seen images of tornadoes. These seem to be the types of structures that create a different type of matter when we see them at the atomic scale that create coherent matter. And I'm going to show you some evidence right in a few moments that show us that defense contractors, the US government, are already working with this type of coherent matter to create teleportation, action at a distance, affecting weather, creating sounds. It just all sounds spookily familiar to some of these experiences. Now, I could be wrong with this comparison, but the similarities are too consistent to ignore, which is why I've moved in this dark matter monster direction, as you saw in the film, Paranormal Bigfoot. So, fractal electromagnetic phantoms, let's continue on. Or, going off of Ron Moorhead, how does Sasquatch move in and out of trees? You've heard this from other people. I spoke to a nurse up in Idaho that has been working with loggers from the 40s and 50s, and they told her from decades ago of seeing these creatures, they didn't know what to call them back then. The term Bigfoot wasn't invented until 1957 by Jerry Crew, that construction group out at Bluff Creek. She said multiple loggers told her they would see these creatures go behind a tree, into a tree, and disappear. So how do you do that? Well, let's take a look at some of the science that I can put to. Okay. So if we go back to electromagnetic vortex structures, it's not new. James Clerk Maxwell, the great Scottish physicist that created the modern ideas of electromagnetism, thought that we had in these ether currents, this vortex structure, from positive to negative to positive to negative. So it's not a totally new idea. Maxwell thought of this over 150 years ago. We were talking about Dr. Takeaki Matsumoto last night, cold fusion researcher from Japan, who was recently, people visited him, Bob Greenyer, Martin Fleischmann Memorial Project, they went over there. This is someone that was banned from presenting and publishing in the US because of his belief that micro orbs and ball lightning were producing what you can see here on the screen, which is micro tornadoes, that what we're calling cold fusion, low energy nuclear reaction. It sounds complex. It's actually a type of ball lightning creating a vortex structure. That's really all it is. And he had, with his meticulous documentation, he had photographs of remnants of these little ball lightnings moving through materials, creating these very interesting looking structures. I guess some of you can't see it, it's all over the screen, but right through these materials that he was experimenting on, and he believed these were these vortex structures moving at a microscopic scale. And even Leonardo da Vinci thought these vortex structures in pools of water were somehow fundamental to how nature works, and this is one of da Vinci's pictures, I believe, from the 1600s of these vortex structures. So, if you do some research into tornadoes, and I recommend Charles Chandler's book online for free, The Electromagnetic Structure of Tornadic Supercell Thunderstorms. It's the question of why can't we predict where you get these supercell tornadoes? There's no, of all the weather prediction we have, you still can't predict when a tornado is going to become a supercell tornado, which thunderstorms are going to become the really strong tornadoes. The models break down. The reason the models break down is we're still using old-fashioned hydrodynamics and thermodynamic models, basically heat transfer, to explain these tornadoes. But as Chandler points out to us, and this is something you all identify with, there are a lot of anomalies in tornadoes. If you've ever spoken to someone who's been in them, you'll know what I'm talking about. Things seem to be floating off the floor. They're not moving around, they're just floating next to you. The color turns green. Even inside buildings, the color turns green. The theory has been that it was reflecting grass in the sky. But you get this green color. I saw it the other day driving up from Boise in this very strong thunderstorm area in the distance. The sky turned like this bluish green. And then there's the weird way that tornadoes don't do uniform damage right at the epicenter of a tornado. It's really patchy. There could be some structures that don't look like they were touched at all, and some that are completely destroyed. So Chandler makes the argument that tornadoes are based on electromagnetic energy. And there's an electromagnetic component to this, which again strengthens our idea that there's a fundamental electrical background to the environments we live in that can occasionally condense into these very strong structures. Like this sort of anomaly. This is a photo of a Hawaiian volcano, and you can see in the ocean there are two tornadoes behind it. Not right next to it, which you would expect from ordinary thermodynamic heat transfer, but in the distance. So how is a volcano causing a tornado out there if there isn't some sort of electromagnetic action at a distance? And even in an incident like 9/11, and it's my view that having talked to the fire chief, my mom lived near the fire chief for that southern Manhattan, he was off that day. I'm convinced it was caused by planes, but still, and we could disagree about that, we can talk about that later, but I've talked to people that were in that area, and there were cars that caught fire blocks away, but no intervening damage. It just sounds very similar to what happens around tornadoes. And then how do you explain phenomena like this? In fact, a friend just wrote me from New York, where I'm from originally, that he was talking to some firefighters that had worked on a tornado squad in the South, and one of these people told him they found a Coke bottle. The cap was still firmly intact, but the liquid was mostly gone and there was dirt in there. How do you do that with ordinary thermodynamics? Or in this picture of a record LP, this is a picture from the 30s, embedded in a telephone post. So again, it suggests that some of these anomalies are electromagnetic in nature. Now, how does it connect to what we are interested in here? Biggie and the Squatchers. If you look in the literature, you'll find that before some Sasquatch encounters, people encounter tornadoes on a clear day. Read some of Carter Bouchard's work. He describes a witness, David, in Canada, describing tornadic activity with no clouds in the sky, which suggests that there's an electromagnetic connection between Bigfoot and the environment. And then going on to other related topics, you're familiar with Skinwalker Ranch. Maybe you've read Skinwalkers at the Pentagon by Lukatsky or Hunt for the Skinwalker. But they describe a lot of really interesting and energy anomalies at Skinwalker Ranch, in addition to the cryptids, the orbs, and that very interesting hitchhiker effect. If you've ever experienced this, you're welcome to tell me about it later, but you know what this is, right? Is where you encounter something spooky and it seems to follow you home. And you've read many encounters or learned many encounters, I'm sure if you've done your research, where people say they had the Sasquatch encounter far from home, they drove home at highway speeds, and that same night they had the Sasquatch activity for the first time outside their home. How is that possible if the Sasquatch is purely a physical entity, unless there's some sort of larger electromagnetic aspect to this? And again, as I mentioned last night, this hitchhiker effect has also been connected to people involved in remote viewing research, or the early days at Stanford and so forth. This is a very interesting book, Strange Effects from UFOs. You get some of these strange effects we were talking about last night. Sudden cooling, sudden quiet, the smell of sulfur. And so we were talking last night, I was talking to someone, sudden fog. Before Sasquatch encounters, you've heard about this. That's also could be related to cooling, sudden cooling. Now, if you're familiar with Stan Gordon's research, I've talked to him a number of times in the past couple months. This is a great reference, Silent Invasion. Stan started his research in 1959 before some of us were even born. Many of us, I would imagine. And from the beginning, he was doing UFO research in Pennsylvania, but Sasquatch came into it. He wasn't looking for it, but it became Sasquatch and UFO research. It's like you couldn't really separate the two. Where you would get these UFO sightings, you would also have these Sasquatch showing up in the same fields, which again supports the idea we were talking about last night, is that we're talking about another reality. I mean, this is just my view of it. That's embedded in our reality. It's a hidden reality, an unseen reality, not necessarily a parallel reality. I'm not afraid to go in that direction of parallel realities. We can have a long discussion about that later. But this seems to be a reality that's embedded in our reality, that's a darker version of our reality, not in a negative way, in an electromagnetic way. It's a type of dark electromagnetism that is not easy to detect. And if these creatures and these entities in these UFOs, whatever the non-human intelligence is, and that's not for me, NHI is not Bigfoot for me. I think they're closer in on the human scale. But that they're sharing some of the same fundamental properties, which is why, we were talking about this earlier over at my booth over there. They share some of the same properties, which is why they show up at the same time, as do orbs, as do ball lightning. Terry Lovelace, the abductee, had his abduction experience in the Air Force, has talked about in his books, Incident at Devil's Den, and his second book, where he had readers share their stories, and you had some of this types of things we're talking about here, including the time loss and so forth. So there's very interesting cosmological factors that support the idea of a type of dark electromagnetism. And this has to do with something that I talked about in the Paranormal Bigfoot movie part 2, Flash of Beauty, relic neutrinos. I'm just mentioning this because we often don't talk about cosmological factors, but researchers like Alexander Parkhomov, and I learned about him from the work of Bob Greener and Martin Fleischman Memorial Project. You can watch their YouTube channel. He created a relic neutrino detector from surplus Soviet equipment as the Soviet Union was falling apart. And these are very small particles that come from the cosmic background radiation from the initial creation of the universe billions of years ago. Why they matter is they're a lot bigger than solar neutrinos and a lot slower than solar neutrinos, and they're large enough to interact with molecules and cells. And Parkhomov was able to show that there are variations in biological and chemical reactions that you can easily measure that are affected by the time of year. Even radioactive decay has a cycle to it based on the time of year. Conventional physics can't explain that if it's just a uniform process, but it would make sense if, as the Earth moves through the solar system rotates around the Milky Way, that we're exposed to this background radiation, and it affects biological and chemical processes. And even in the time span since I've been involved in this area, the Wikipedia entry on relic neutrinos has changed from something that's purely theoretical. If you look up relic neutrinos now and cosmic neutrino background, all of a sudden, magically, there is strong indirect evidence for relic neutrinos. So just in a year or two, it's changed from this debate where people told me this was totally fictitious, and this is just one researcher in Russia, to something where we're told it's strong indirect evidence. So relic neutrinos show us there's a cosmological influence, and relic neutrinos are bosonic. They promote reactions. They create something called inverse beta decay, and they're another type of energy source. We can't detect them directly, but they have a gravitational effect on us that could influence properties here that are hard to explain. Relic neutrinos are a type of dark matter. If you get into debate with people about dark matter being the other matter in the universe that we can't see, that experiments show us outnumber our physical visible matter of a factor of 10 to 1, relic neutrinos seem to occupy about 1 or 2% of all dark matter, which outnumbers all the visible matter. So 1 or 2% sounds small, but it outnumbers all our visible matter. So most of the matter in the universe is invisible. It shouldn't be surprising that they're invisible life forms, just from that point of view, if most of the matter around us, and it's here. You know, I used to think that dark matter was just something way out in the cosmos, but if you do your research, it's around the Earth, it clusters around anything with gravity, and the dark matter is not just something that's little particles. We've learned that it forms strings of dark matter that could move around. You won't see them, but they could embed themselves in physical structures. And recent articles show us that black holes, we were talking about this last night, they're not just little round objects like marbles. They can form little fuzzy strings, and you may not even know they're around, but they can come into the atmosphere in micro black holes. Now don't worry, these micro black holes are not going to eat up the universe. It's not going to be there's a certain experiment that's going to cause everything. They're very short-lived. They're very powerful, but very short-lived. And there is evidence from people's experiences that these do come into the atmosphere sometime. There have been cases in Russia where people hit the ceiling and gravity temporarily collapsed for a few seconds and everything went upwards. The authorities said it was a natural gas explosion, but there was really no evidence for that at the time. And I was able to learn from a former Secretary of Defense, and I got permission to share this story, even though I was told it was classified before, and I put it in Dark Matter Monsters book, that there was a case, I mean, very few people know about this, there was a case in the Midwest of a town that had a total electromagnetic collapse for 24 hours in the 60s. Their batteries didn't work. Anything electronic didn't work, not just things plugged into the outlets. There was no electromagnetism for 24 hours. It must have been a very small town. And this person asked me, how do you think we detected that? Right? An electromagnetic collapse in one little town in the Midwest. I don't know, and he wouldn't tell me. But obviously, the military has sensor systems that cover the entire United States and pick up events like this. Okay. So there are weird electromagnetic events, collapses of electromagnetism, possibly black holes coming into the atmosphere. When these have been seen going across villages, the nails are getting ripped out of the roofs, trailing these objects behind them. So we do have evidence for this. It's just not widely known about or shared. Now, this actually has physical implications. You may have heard of psychokinesis, PK, micro PK. This is something I've studied a lot. Princeton Engineering Anomalies Lab, 79 to 2007, Bob John. They did experiments where they took people like you and had them affect a random number generator. And they found that when people were focused on the random number generator, it became less random. And this is what the graph looks like. Now, this should not be happening if conventional physics is true. If they had people think about zeros, you can see that bottom blue line. The device spat out more zeros. Only 2 to 3 per 10,000, but that's still a lot over billions of events. If they tried to make the device go towards 1, you had more ones. And they found, think about resonance here, because this is where we're going with this, that if you had a couple, they could affect the machine more than a single person. A bonded pair, as they call them. So your minds can actually affect machines. You were wondering why they would do this experiment. It was funded by McDonnell Douglas because they were concerned that pilots, if they got really ticked off in the cockpit, might fry the electronics. And they found that this effect was not strong enough for them to fry the electronics, but there was an effect. And I've seen examples of this because when I went to Japan a number of years ago teaching RV, one of my students who was a surgeon said, you have to go visit this guy north of Nagasaki who can bend objects with his mind and do all sorts of interesting things. And I couldn't take pictures while he was doing this demonstration, which was free, by the way. He was able to melt glass with his hands. You can see this Coke bottle is turned briefly into a liquid. Spoons. And the strangest thing, I don't think I ever recovered from this, he was floating a yen note, the currency there, over his hand, floating. I'm thinking there has to be a wire. I mean, I'm sorry, I have a kind of mind like you do, it's a little skeptical. I'm just not trained to believe it's floating above his palm, and then he puts a cigarette and it's floating. And it's like he must have seen my doubt, because he looked right at me, and that cigarette went flying off his palm into my shirt pocket, 20 feet away. And that cigarette went into my shirt pocket with force. And I still have the cigarette. There were no magnets. There was no conventional explanation for this. It was some sort of ability to project or control energy at a distance. Again, think of what Biggie is capable of doing. And this is a human, ordinary human. He told me it took him 10 years to train, daily training like a martial art to be able to do this. I was told by someone in my RV class that the head of Sony, Morita, they took their best cameras to film this guy at 10,000 frames a second, and they couldn't explain what he was doing, but there was no tricks. They looked at every frame at 10,000 frames a second. So there really are people, and you've heard of Yuri Geller and Nina Kuligina in Russia. You can see YouTube videos of her moving objects around. This may have something to do with the ability to control relic neutrinos since they affect mass. In other words, what I'm suggesting to you is that relic neutrinos aren't just some abstract thing for physicists, that there are some humans that are able to use coherent resonance to project streams of relic neutrinos, to project cigarettes into my pocket. This guy also was able to make the hands of my watch move around without actually touching the ground. And then at the very one time, I saw him twice. When everyone had left, and one of my, some of our RV people were there, he said, I'm going to show you what this feels like. And he ran his hand over my arm at a couple inches, and it felt like really strong electrical shocks going in there, which is exactly what Nikola Tesla described being around his pulse discharge devices, is a tingling feeling in the bone. This is exactly what this felt like. It was very alarming, and I was very reassured when he told me he worked at the local hospital for good to employ this to heal people. But I felt it myself. My skepticism went away. I mean, I am obviously still interested in wondering how this connects to all our subjects we're interested in, but I've seen this. This is not just a story. So, people like Boyd Bushman from Lockheed Martin have talked about this dark neutrino universe. Bushman said, well, there is another universe called the neutrino universe, of course. We know that it's there, and we're seeing if it's one of the additional forces. Not only that, we know that everything we see is only 5%, and there's dark matter we don't see, that's about more of it, and then there's dark energy, which is 70% of the universe. And that's what we're talking about. These energies we don't know have been cataloged, we don't even have names for them. But we're just beginning to understand them. So you can see defense contractors are getting interested in this. because it has applications, military applications. And you guys can see where this is going. They're going to tell us that Bigfoot, Sasquatch, Biggie is a mythological creature until they get a patent in the processes behind some of this. I'm not explaining all of it away. And then all of a sudden, we knew this all along. Oh, and here's our patent, you know. We know how this game works. But Lockheed Martin, I'm going to show you more evidence in a second how Lockheed Martin is working with this. But these sort of dark energy forces are something that, you know, is the stuff of black budget programs. It wouldn't be surprising that there are life forms on Earth that are way ahead of us naturally that know how to use this, especially predators, for survival, right? You would harness these neutrino forces, the dark matter forces, because that's what nature does. Nature doesn't waste anything. There is more evidence for this. I'll just go through this briefly. The Department of Energy has been studying this since the 1950s. They had a guy named Winston Bostic, who's a really brilliant guy, that believed, just like Takeaki Matsumoto, that you could recreate the galactic forces in a test tube. He was working on something called Project Sherwood, which was an attempt to harness nuclear energy after World War II for peaceful purposes, basically to turn hydrogen bombs into something useful, and they figured they could use this propulsion to get to Mars in like 15 hours or something. And he created what he called galaxies in a test tube. Even the New York Times had an article. They were right for once. They had an article about physicists. He was at Princeton, and then he went to one of the California universities, but he worked for DOE. And this later became classified research, which is why we haven't heard about this. But these do look a lot like galaxies, and he created them in a test tube from plasma fusion. Plasma being the state of matter, you know, electrically active gases, which is the bulk of the matter in the universe. All the nebulas, aurora borealis, lightning, and fluorescent lights are all types of plasmas. And Bostic was able to turn these plasmas into structures and create propulsion systems, which might be a basis for classification because you had a new type of propulsion which was really strong. A plasma gun. So once we can weaponize it, folks, it's real. Until then, it's just mythology. Okay? And then we had Ken Shoulders, this really brilliant guy that created the electronic masking techniques that are in all our cell phones. Microelectronics. He worked for NSA, no such agency. And he created these masking electronic techniques. And he realized that when he was working with this electronics, that there were these microscopic electrical charge clusters all around us all the time that he initially called strong electrons, electron validium in Latin, and he later called exotic vacuum objects. And Shoulders realized that these charge clusters could be the basis of all types of energy systems and different types of technology. And a lot of his work was subsequently classified and we have evidence for held out of this public discussion, even though he thought the best way to deal with this was to make it public so we could all start talking about charge clusters. Because what he found, as I showed you last night, that image of that dark black ball lightning, is that they have a white form and then they have an invisible black form. And they can embed themselves in metals and then come out again and do their little electronic magic at will. And if you made them charge neutral, you could move them through walls. You're talking about moving small solid objects through a wall, if you could make it charge neutral. So Ken Shoulders, who was a colleague of Hal Puthoff and worked at SRI, where remote viewing was developed, you start looking at his research and he felt that these exotic vacuum objects could be the basis of biological life, but not ordinary biological life. He felt that they could create electronic interactions at electronic speeds, like a really fast form of life. And we heard Rich Germeau and our first speaker of the day, Rob Alley, talking about the way they can move Bigfoot silently and quickly. It just seems almost unnatural, the speed and the silence. Well, Ken Shoulders was talking about this at a smaller scale. Well, I'm just going to read one quote from you and let's see if this resonates. One of the things not mentioned is the likelihood of forming totally black organizations with ghostly properties and being able to operate without our ability to see them in any presently available way. Now, what does that sound like? Black organizations with ghostly properties. I don't know, folks, but to me that sounds a lot like cryptids. You know, all of them, plus Bigfoot, whether you think that's a cryptid or not. Black organizations, maybe everything we've been calling ghosts are actually these various types of invisible charge cluster life forms. I'm not reducing it just to physical explanation. I'm saying maybe they're based on this alternative type of charge cluster that has a black invisible form. Not black in a negative way, we're talking energetically. And this would legitimize the entire field of paranormal phenomena like that, if this is what it is. Now, if you have another explanation, I'm open to other possibilities, but so far to me, this seems like it's lining up a lot of the characteristics of this phenomena which either you've encountered, some of you here have encountered, or you've heard the encounters. You can't avoid about hearing these encounters. There's so many good podcasts and YouTube channels. You can hear this 24/7. And it's very similar things that sound to me like this sort of dark charge cluster, dark matter, dark neutrino universe. And beautifully enough, these charge clusters naturally form fractal patterns like trees. In other words, they look like nature because they are nature. Those of us in the modern world are always attempting to linearize things and put them in lines, like telephone lines, electrical lines, because that's how modern mechanistic technology works. But that's not how nature wants to do it. And this is why you see ball lightning emerging from power lines and things like this, because it doesn't want to stay confined to a line. Even though that's how our modern efficiency mentality works, and it supports our modern lifestyle, it actually wants to be in a fractal branching structure. And maybe these cryptids know how to use that in a way which gives them advantages over us. These charge clusters like to form bead chains. They naturally form their own structures. And it was Shoulders that suggested, and this is sort of for me just the inspiration for dark matter monsters, is he said, when talking about these exotic vacuum objects, he said it might even be appropriate to say that there's a black universe that is connected to dark matter, which dominates in quantity over our normal matter. So this sort of dark matter universe connected to exotic vacuum objects outnumbers our visible universe, which means there's more of them than more of us. But I guess that's not surprising. And then again, this is Shoulders is saying they're in our reality, but they're not quite coupled to our matter in the same way. They have a different permittivity. So they're there, it's hard to describe it. They're there and they're sort of not there at the same time. You could encounter them, but they're not coupled into our reality. He even talks about these exotic vacuum objects gliding and sliding around faster than ordinary matter. What does that sound like? Gliding and sliding really quickly in an unnatural way. When you talk to people that have seen this, they said they couldn't even walk over these slash pile areas and rugged areas, and yet the Sasquatch Biggie was able to just zip up to the top, and it took them like half an hour. And then when they got there, it feels like electrically charged, but there's a static feeling. I don't know. To me, it sort of connects the dots. It doesn't have to agree. I'm not saying you have to believe in this. This is what makes sense to me as a kind of from a scientific point of view. And then he talks about how these types of life forms and structures can form complex organisms at electronic rates. And again, the main thing that he found was that their permittivity declined. And as your permittivity, this is the electrical constant of space, permittivity being the ability of a material to resist an external electrical field. It varies for different materials. It's different for air versus solid material. But it's normally set at 1 by physicists in free space. Well, it goes down from 1, which means these objects would have a different speed of light, because I'll show you in a moment, the speed of light is based on permittivity and permeability. That would mean they start looking bluish. And we've had reports of Bigfoot glowing blue. And you've heard about the glowing eyes, and some of you who I've talked to have seen them. Maybe this is a little what we're talking about. Maybe it's not the eyes that are glowing. Maybe the entire creature is glowing, but it's just the translucent part where the light's getting emitted from. That's just one possibility. But I mean, there's definitely a scientific basis for glowing organisms here. And people have said that blue glow from the Bigfoot was so big it cast a light in their car as they were hiding from it while the battery wasn't working, surprisingly, all of a sudden. And we're told this happens around Dogman also, the battery failure. So it looks like some of these creatures are using similar principles, if this is what it is. And I won't read all of this for you, but James Lukatsky talks about this, skinwalkers at the Pentagon, some of these dark objects they encountered on Skinwalker Ranch. And I talked to Jay Stratton about this once. He was head of the UAP task force. He arranged these briefings in front of Congress. You haven't seen a lot of him, but he's been working behind the scenes since the OSAP and ATIP programs to get these witnesses in front of Congress. And I personally believe it's going to start with UFO hearings. There are more coming up in a couple of weeks, but it'll get around to Bigfoot and cryptids eventually. I don't see how you can avoid that. I think it'll be a good thing to have a public discussion about this. But when I asked Jay Stratton about these dark black ball lights, I said, was that what you saw? You were the one that saw it. He's Axelrod in the book. I think it's come out. And this is what he said. This is kind of a good answer. He said, well, that's how your brain interprets it, as a dark black object. But we don't know if that's what it is. It's the best your brain can do to make sense of it. Fine, maybe, whatever. But so we've had a lot of kind of confirmation sightings of these types of things. Now, this is what Shoulders talked about. Again, that makes me think of cryptids, and the activity around Bigfoot is, he said that these dark exotic vacuum objects create a type of superconductivity. There's less electrical resistance, so you have greater levels of power without the resistance we have in ordinary electronics, which creates heat, which is why our batteries go out. But he said the black EV is bounded by a high permittivity space, our reality, but within this cocoon, the black EV slides around with ease. So these objects are going to move around much more quickly than we are, and they're going to seem like they're sliding and gliding around. Just think about that. We saw this photo last night of the dark ball lightning. You heard about John Hutchinson. He was able to melt metals at room temperature, recreating some of Tesla's experimental devices in Canada in his lab. Tesla used very large pulse discharge devices. This is actually a composite photo. It didn't happen all at once. But what Hutchinson was able to show us is that you can melt metal at room temperature. And you've had accounts around Bigfoot of things melting, things changing. I mean, have you heard of objects being repaired mysteriously overnight? I mean, they seem to have the ability to engage materials and even fix things for people. I know people that have had objects show up like a plumber's wrench exactly when they're having a flood in the kitchen. They went out, this is in Alabama, and this friend of mine, Jewel, said she was just beside herself with this leaking water, and she went outside to cry, and right there was the perfect plumber's wrench in the middle of nowhere, Alabama. And she had thought they were around. So this is the ability to melt metals at room temperature. This is a coin embedded in metal at room temperature, and someone put their thumb in the metal. It won't burn you. We're talking about solid objects becoming liquefied without heat, just through nucleonic transmutation of the elements. And again, Takeaki Matsumoto mentioned these small black holes. As I mentioned a few moments ago, there have been scientific articles recently arguing that black holes can take a stringy form also. And even articles saying that if you imagine, like Matsumoto, black holes embedded in metals, it does a better job of explaining electrical flow than the conventional models we have to explain how electrons move through metals. Just imagining that they're black holes embedded in ordinary metal, something that Matsumoto believed he saw. And again, what we're saying here is this is how the universe naturally works. Matsumoto was just saying what we see happening far away in the cosmos is happening from a fractal scale, as above, so below, in a microscopic scale. And what we call cold fusion Leonard is just a sort of reproduction of what happens in neutron stars and black holes at the farthest scales of the cosmos, just at our scale. And that you end up creating dark matter here. Not just way out there like we used to believe. And I learned about this from going to the University of Arizona when I was there doing my master's degree in sociology. I'd go to the astrophysics planetarium on one night a week. They'd have these great lectures about dark matter and dark energy. But it was presented as something way out there. But these researchers are saying is it's here. And if it's here, you're going to get some of these strange effects to us that look kind of weird, and some life forms are going to be exhibiting this too, in my humble opinion. And these forces are actually stronger than gravity out there because they're electromagnetic, as Matsumoto said, 40 times stronger than the gravitational force. And one of the effects you see here is nucleonic transmutation, alchemy. And this comes from the work of Bob Grieder, MFMP. I showed you Matsumoto's book last night, and on the cover of that, you can see carbon film coming out of a pure lead ball. Here is a case of carbon mist coming out of pure lead at room temperature. We're not talking about heating here. We're talking about compression, electromagnetic energy like Hutchinson Tesla. It creates nucleonic transmutation. And there was a lab in Kyiv, Ukraine a number of years ago. Stanislav Adamenko and Wysotsky created something called Proton 21 Labs. And they did something like 8,000 successful cold fusion experiments. And they were so successful, they were bought by our Department of Energy here in the US and moved to Fermi Labs and then Oakridge in Tennessee and taken offline. They're gone in the black budget world. So if this isn't happening, why is the DOE buying up companies that can produce this? It's part of DOE's fusion program now. Again, sort of what we're saying here is that this exists, but a lot of it's been classified. It shouldn't be. This is how nature works. This is something we should be talking about here. Mark LeClaire, a number of years ago in Boulder at a Breakthrough Energy Conference, showed us that he had, through sound waves, cavitation generated every element in the periodic table, starting with ordinary elements and tap water, and it likes to move down to lead. So you can move between elements. In high school, you and I were told that alchemy was some sort of fiction from the medieval times, from Middle Ages, but it turns out to be real. So you get these very interesting circular patterns, just a connection back to crop circles like we were talking about last night, these crop circular patterns. You get ball lightning. Now, ball lightning has been around for a long time. I'm sure some of you have seen it. There was research by the Air Force in 1995 from J. Reese Roth that said 20% of Americans have seen ball lightning. And they did more research on this in 2003. And the interesting thing about this Air Force paper, this is just historical woodcuts of ball lightning that people have experienced, often coming down chimneys where there's a lot of dust. This is the same thing we're talking about here, orbs, exotic vacuum objects, just larger scale. Half of that paper about ball lightning, which, it could show up any time, was whited out. I mean, it's redacted. And when you looked at the reasons for it, it had to do with research and propulsion systems, which probably goes back to Winston. So again, I'm just suggesting that people are studying this. Now, more evidence from the DOE, they did research on ball lightning. What they found is it's created, yeah, you guys are hanging in there in the sun, you're very brave. Ball lightning seems to be a type of magnetic compression where the particles become monochromatic, which means they're at the same frequency and the same temperature. Now this comes from David Freiberger at Stanford from DOE-funded research. And they were looking at the Hessdalen lights, right? Now this is all going to connect back to Bigfoot in a second because people see worms around Bigfoot and other cryptids, right? I mean, witnesses in Colorado I've talked to have said they've seen Bigfoot emerge from orbs. And we saw this in a flash of beauty paranormal of Bigfoot where the witnesses at the end see it turn into a glowing orange cube, like, seriously? But yeah, that's what this says. And Freiberger's believed that this was an extension of Maxwellian electrodynamics. Instead of having the magnetic and electric fields at right angles, you could change what he called the diality angles of electricity and magnetism, and you would create different extended electromagnetic effects. So that Maxwell's equations were correct, but if you extend Maxwell, you end up with ball lightning and what they call mobile luminous objects, MLOs. He calls his object the Vorton, and it's not all that different from John Wheeler at Princeton in the 50s, created this object called the Geon, alternating magnetic and electrical vortex type shape, which he called the Kugelblitz, which is the German name for ball lightning. It also means a black hole. Go figure. Kugelblitz, Wheeler was talking about black holes, but it literally translates in German to ball lightning. So black holes and ball lightning, we're all talking about the same thing here, folks. Electromagnetic collapse. Through electrostatic charges, through sound, through cavitation, you can create a whole type of extended physics. We learned to do this from the lab, but my belief is that the creatures and beings that we're studying and interested in here, and some of us have actually encountered, are already naturally engaging with these types of processes from thousands of years of evolution. Somehow we forgot how to do it, and we're using technology instead. So this is an example of what we're talking about here is coherent matter. However you get there through cavitation, through diality angles, the particles are at the same frequency. It's one step past plasmas, from solid to liquid to gas to plasmas to coherent matter. It's been created in the lab, Bose-Einstein condensate. When they did this, and this wasn't far from where I live in Boulder, it's at like really cold temperatures, like minus 300 Kelvin. And you could create these like larger molecular states. This is matter. I heard you, Astro. This is matter that's turned into a wave. So we often have this debate in the Bigfoot community. Is it, we were talking about this last night. This is the perennial debate. Flesh and blood or quantum woo. Well, guess what, folks? Great. Matter becomes energy equals mc squared. But you don't just need to do this at minus temperatures. Lockheed Martin in this fascinating patent, and I talked about this in Paranormal Bigfoot, said they could create the equivalent of a laser with any type of particle just by creating coherency with their device. This is a patent that they applied for. And that they could create what they call a massive counterpart to lasers, coherent matter wave fields. It could be done with any particle at any temperature. And that the applications of this would be to create systems that could control weather at a distance, objects at a distance, teleportation, all this cool stuff, technologically. And it's through something called the Uran-Bohm effect, where you just align the particles together. So if you can do this in the lab, wouldn't you think that nature is already doing it around us? Life or coherency. This is the name of the game. So we're talking about coherent matter, and you've all seen this with lasers, but this is talking about creating the equivalent of a laser with sound, with any type of energy. And the analogy to this, if you want to use your imagination, this would be like reverberations of birds that you've all seen, where the birds are like a wave in the sky and they're all turning into months or flocks, schools of fish. This is what we're talking about. But to be able to do with any type of matter. In other words, an indirect type of control without energy exchange, with frequency resonance. And so this is really what the name of the game here is. John Ramirez talked about this with the CIA using their keyhole satellites to observe these plasmas in the atmosphere coming in from outside. Even these UFOs, he said, sometimes appeared as stealth dark matter plasmas. He called them dark plasmas. So what we're saying is that we already have evidence here from research, from defense contractor patents, of energy being used to create coherency, to create action at a distance, and what almost seems like paranormal effects. So the essence of my argument here is this is already in the scientific world, in the black budget world. But you can see it in their patents that they're already talking about using this as a type of control technology. It's often the case that this technology already exists in the black budget world before we see it decades later. But it already exists. And we looked at this last night with the toroidal bagel shape from the Soviet-Russian research, fractal electromagnetics. So however you get there from the fractal electromagnetics or from Freiberger's working with diality angles to create a compressed magnetic surface, any type of this compression creates monochromatic structures. And in the end, fractal electromagnetic systems. And in these fractal electromagnetic systems, you end up with a state of matter that doesn't quite resolve to a line, but it's solid, but the closer you look, the more space you see, phantom layout. Pavlov's mirror in Czechoslovakia even believes this is the structure of the atom. And it doesn't look like the way we were taught in school, as you can see on the left side, that the atomic structure is made of rings within rings within rings. So this is just another way to relate to reality. And if fractal structures exist at the atomic level, they would just keep building up to larger and larger fractal structures that are both solid and material and resonant at the same time, capable of producing electromagnetic phantom-like effects. Or at least that's my interpretation of it. And if you have another point of view on this, Harold Putoff in 2018 told us something similar from his work in the OSAP program as a scientist. If you start doing this, you change the fundamental physics constants, you change the speed of light. Basically, you're creating very weird objects, space-time metric engineering. But there have been articles like this. You saw this article not too long ago about these orbs and plasmas in the atmosphere and so forth. So this seems to explain a lot of anomalous lights, Hessdalen, Norway. This is not a UFO. This is all lightning. According to my understanding, it looks like UFOs. Even at a microscopic scale or a large scale, the impacts look similar, whether it's in the ground or at atomic scale. So I'm just making the argument here, these are similar. Now, one last piece of evidence here, and again, thanks for listening. Here is an article about using Buckminster Fuller's fullerenes, carbon molecular structures. Remember, he would do a lot of research like this in the past, 60s and 70s. Bucky fusion, they called this fusion plasma, electrodynamic fusion plasma, something similar. At the very end of the article, it says, at press time received information that the patent application has been bucked up to DOE or DOD for classification review. I'm not making this up. We never heard about Bucky fusion again. It could have been powering our cars by now. So in any case, here's Don. Don, I got you from the Bailey conference with Igor. A number of you. Don, again, was one of the first researchers I met, and Igor. They shared their stories with me. But in any case, folks, this is just a couple slides from the Marley Ranch in Missouri. You've heard about that, Ted Phillips. Similar types of cryptids. We're seeing their strange cryptids. They could walk through barbed wire fences, but they left hair. I mean, this is the argument, folks, is they're both flesh and blood, and they have these spooky characteristics at the same time. Ted Phillips talked about this. Left huge footprints, a couple 100 pounds deep, but only had 4 digits. Go figure. And then just to sum it up again, from Flash of Beauty, Paranormal Bigfoot, we've had witnesses who've seen Bigfoot turn into glowing orange cubes and then shoot off into the forest. So in summary, I think this does have to do with resonance, creating coherent states of matter, and my argument would be that life on Earth that we don't understand very well because we always think we're the top of the food chain. They understand more about this than we do, at least intuitively. And while we went in the direction of mechanical technology, they went in the direction of natural technology, working with earth energies, natural background, electromagnetism, to create what seem to us like paranormal, superhuman powers. But I think you can see from this research, it's just an extension of some of this research that's being done right now in physics and cold fusion and linear and so forth. So to sum it up, we have this universe we're used to seeing, and then we have the dark matter universe that's layered into this universe with its own set of principles. Somehow, ChatGPT turned it into dark matter universe, which is kind of cool. So there's the linear ordinary universe, you see it as the dark matter fractal universe, and they kind of coexist together. So thanks for listening, folks. I'm happy to talk to you later in my booth. Any couple questions? Anyone want to challenge me or present another point of view or whatever? Share a story. Anybody? You, sir, you have a question?
I got a question for you.
Go ahead.
As far as, I'll grab a mic here.
Yes.
When it comes to neutrino,
Test. 1, 2, 2. When it comes to the, you mentioned the boxes of light, not so much an orb, but literally a shaft or a rod or a box, sometimes a rectangle, not necessarily a square. What I would think of a plasma field as being something that has to be circular just based upon how it gathers itself. How is it gathering in a square or a shape?
So that's a really good question, folks. And I wondered the same sort of thing since the movie.
Yeah, right in the mic.
Yeah, well, people have seen these toroidal forms in their bedrooms spontaneously form as donuts, which shouldn't be surprising. We've been talking about fractal donuts. So it can also form this toroidal shape. But last night I showed you that picture of that fractal called the Sierpinski gasket, which is triangular based. So I think it's possible in the different types of environments we find on Earth, different types of constraints, you could get other shapes which represent the sort of least energy, sort of what nature likes to do is just take the path of least energy. Maybe sometimes the square or even a triangle is the easiest way for the energy to form. But it's definitely a good question, so thanks for that.
Was it a classified question?
I can't answer that.
Hey, just so you know, anybody know who Jay Stratton is? Any UFO nerds out here? Jay Stratton? We're talking about ATIP, Pentagon. No? He's seen biologics, been inside UFOs. Okay, so Jay Stratton is super muckety-muck UFO guy, connected beyond, right? Read in, let's say, been in several skiffs, let's say. He walks up to our booth in Vernal, Utah, at Phenomenon. By the way, go check out Phenomenon in Vernal, Utah, September. It's a phenomenal UFO conference. You're 20 minutes outside Skinwalker Ranch. So I'm emceeing like I am here today with you at Phenomenon. And he comes up to the booth, to Brett and Jill, and this guy walks up and he goes, by the way, you got the science right. And he walked away. And so for a guy like Jay Stratton, super read in, this is the science. I don't mean Dr. Fauci. This is the real science here. And so, thank you, Simeon, for making it right. everybody.
Thank you guys for having an open mind.
Okay, Priscilla, and I don't mean Elvis's wife, I mean the better looking Priscilla. Get up here. Come on, Priscilla. Now, I don't know what's totally happened. Forgive Priscilla, she's out of breath, but take a deep one here. She comes bearing gifts. Tell people a little bit about what's going on.
Hold that nice and close.
Okay, so we're going to do the 50-50 raffle.
Nice and close.
That is going to be in the 8 o'clock hour for the